I have helped 1,693 podcasts grow. My agency produces and grows 40 podcasts at any point in time. And in this video, I'm going to show you how Joe Rogan has gone from 0 to 190 million downloads per month and got the Spotify's top podcast for 5 consecutive years. We are going to look at the 6 aspects of Joe's podcast that made his success. And we are going to see how you can apply some of those strategies to avoid having a never-growing podcast. So, first thing that we want to look at is the mission. First and foremost, why does mission and vision even matter? So, you should ask yourself, why should people listen to your podcast, right? That's the foundation of everything. If people don't know why they are tuning in, well, they won't, right? And people know exactly what they're going to get when they tune in to Joe Rogan's experience. And here is what. So, Joe Rogan describes his podcast as something and somewhere where he can have open, honest, and engaging conversations with a wide variety of guests. So obviously here, this is rather broad, right? You do not want to start a podcast with that approach in 2025 because the market is busy now and super crowded. But you have to remember that Joe Rogan started in 2009. And since then, he had guests like Donald Trump, Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Mr. Beast, and so on and so forth. So now his podcast is so big that he can really attract the top minds of their industry on the podcast. Now, this is not something everybody can do, right? On Joe Rogan's side, he has conversations with those greatest minds, should I precise, in the English-speaking world. And he wants to have genuine and unconditional curiosity, and he also approaches his podcast with certain comedic aspect, right? That's his identity. It is a very long format podcast, right? The average episode length is 2 hours and 38 minutes, which is definitely not small. And he really stays true to himself, right? And like with Joe Rogan, what you see is what you get, right? And he says it, like the way he is on the podcast is the way he is in real life. Genuinely curious. He has strong opinions on certain topics, sometimes loosely held, right? Because if he's presented with facts and something else on the podcast, he will be like, oh, interesting. But so that's the identity of the podcast. So what can we actually learn from the Joe Rogan's experience? Well, first of all, Joe has been around for 16 years, right? That's not nothing. That's almost 2 full decades. And the podcast space is much more crowded now than when he started in 2009. So now if you start a podcast, the more niche, the better, because you have some very generalist podcasts like Joe Rogan. Now, for him, what we can learn from Joe Rogan is you know exactly what you're getting when you tune in on the show, right? A very long conversation with a great guest that can go in all directions, but that is a genuine and insightful episode. Now, when you're thinking about the mission of your podcast, you should ask yourself exactly this. Why should I tune in? Why should somebody even tune in? What is it that they are for sure gonna get if they listen to an episode? Any of them, right? And if you manage to define that, then you have created a brand and a vision and a mission for your podcast. And that's the first pillar of growing a successful show. So next is content quality. For us, quality is the number 1 criteria of a successful podcast. And here I'm talking about the audio, obviously, but also the content quality and the video quality. Now, let's first look at audio for Joe, right? So Joe obviously is a professional podcaster, right? He releases 1 episode per day of 2 to 3 hours. So he definitely does that full time and is very well paid for this. So when we look at his setup, right? So he has a headset. All the speakers have a headset. Actually, they are all connected to all microphones, including the own speaker's voice. So when you speak on the Joe Rogan's podcast, you can hear yourself in your headset. This is to avoid if there are more than 2 people in the conversation. This is to avoid overlap, right? Which kind of ruins a bit the experience for the listener as well. So he has thought of this. For the microphone, he has a Shure SM7B, a vocal for all the speakers, so it's one of the best microphones when it comes to podcasting. And he has a sound engineer / live assistant for all the episodes who's called Jamie Vernon. So obviously here, Joe is best in class. Now, this is impeccable audio, but not everybody can nor needs to afford all this, right? So here is what you can actually do and what you actually need to have great audio on your podcast. So what you need is each speaker with earphones or a software that will cancel echo, right? So if you use Riverside, for instance, when you record remotely, Riverside automatically proposes a echo cancellation feature, which you can toggle on, and you're sure to not hear too much echo. The other thing that you can do, and it has just changed the way we do podcasts, is to use a tool called enhanced speech from Adobe. We'll put the link in the description. You put a raw file in there and you can choose from 0 to 100% a level of enhancements generated by AI. And it is becoming very, very efficient. So if you have a guest that doesn't have an amazing audio, just open enhanced speech from Adobe. You can put in here the raw recording and choose the level of enhancement to make it sound like it's in a professional studio recording. Now, next, there is the content. So content is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of a podcast, period. Like you can literally have the best audio and the best video, which we're going to tackle in a second. But if the content is bad, you will not get any download, you will not get any growth, period. So when it comes to Joe Rogan, what is he actually doing in the content? So he has long conversations, right? Which allows him to have a huge depth to the conversation and insights from the guests, which are, again, the top minds of their industry. So just by essence, his podcast provides you with amazing insights from the greatest minds in the industry of people. Also, he has those top tier guests, right? From different industry, different horizons. And this is a virtual circle. Obviously, people know that Joe has great content on the podcast. So more and more amazing people are incentivized to come on Joe's podcast because they know they will tap into a big audience. They will also bring their audience with them, which will allow Joe to benefit from that. And it's a virtual circle of great content. Also, if you listen to Joe Rogan's podcast, you'll notice that Joe makes it super understandable for everybody with a touch of humor, right? So it is entertaining, it is interesting, and Joe will never get too much into the jargon or lingo of a specific industry. He will always make sure that the guest breaks it down properly before going more and more in depth. And that means that this podcast is listenable by virtually anybody that speaks English. Now, the thing that we need to note about Joe's podcast is that there is no specific theme or topic, right? Depending on the guest, the topic may vary tremendously, which is something that Joe can afford to do because he has just the biggest podcast in the world, but that I wouldn't necessarily recommend if you're starting a podcast. So, what can we learn from this? First of all, not everybody can get the quality of guest that Joe has, nor record for 3 hours every day. And if anything, we can say that no one else than Joe can actually get the type of guest that he is getting. Now, if you are creating a podcast or if you're trying to grow your podcast, you need to create content for a very specific niche first that people want to listen to. The narrower the niche, the better. And actually, you can choose a topic according to your niche, i.e. if you are a business owner. So what I would do if I were you, and this is the thing that we first do when we start working with a podcaster, is research what type of content people are already looking for on tools like Google Trends, Google Keywords Planner, social media trends. And so all the 6 main social media platforms, right? What is it when we type in a specific keyword linked to the industry of the podcast we are looking to launch? What is the content that pops up, right? What is it that people consume of? Are the high number of views topics that we can inspire ourselves from to create great podcast content? You can also look at Reddit communities, right? And the questions that they ask and that they exchange on. Quora's questions are a goldmine when it comes to very specific niche content as well. And of course, you should try to get the biggest personalities and influencers from your industry on your podcast as fast as possible, because again, this will compound positively for you and your podcast and the next guest afterwards. So this is what we can learn from Joe's podcast when it comes to content. Now, last but certainly not least, video. So video podcasts, in my opinion, is not optional anymore. Like when you think about YouTube, YouTube is also the number one platform for people to consume podcasts. I'll put the link towards the surveys and the studies validating this already back in 2023. Also, when it comes to Spotify, Spotify reports that 1 in 3 users in the US engages with video podcasts and 1 in 4 worldwide. So video is becoming overwhelmingly present and we cannot overlook it anymore. It also allows you to extract great snippets for social media, but we're going to get back to this in a few minutes. So when we look at Joe's setup, and this is not even the most recent one, but it's just to give you an idea, right? So first of all, he has at least 3 cameras, right? 1 main camera and 1 for each speaker. Joe also has top-notch lighting, right? If we look at the setup, we see that each speaker has a light in front of them to make their face more bright, and therefore it's easier to connect with the emotions of each speaker. There are also some ambience lights, some colored lights, like it is really top notch. We also have Jamie here, who does live camera monitoring, depending on who speaks and who talks. And of course, to monitor all this, there is a Mac Pro here. Now, this is clearly top video quality. Now, again, not everybody can nor needs to implement a whole studio like this. Now, what can we learn from this? So again, Joe Rogan was really ahead of the curve with video podcasts. That's one of the first things that he started when he launched his podcast. You don't need such a setup to start, to be very, very, very clear. One camera per speaker, especially in remote setup, is more than sufficient. Worst case, your laptop camera, right? But a tripod with an iPhone camera, for instance, does the job. Most of the people have a phone that they can film with, and you can buy a tripod. It costs literally $15 on Amazon. I'm recording right now this very video with an iPhone 11 camera and a tripod, and it does the job, right? If you have proper lighting, you don't need much more. And that's my next point. So you need a little bit of lighting if you want your camera to look good and your image to look good, and most importantly, to be able to do snippets for social media. So one indirect global light is good. You want one key light, and optional, you can have edge lights, practical lights, and colored lights. Now, you might be thinking that I'm speaking Chinese here. So let's look at what this means exactly. So suppose you're here and the camera is here. You want one key camera, right, to be able to have your face a bit more bright. This is why you see this part of my face being a bit more bright, because my key light is here. Behind it, you want an edge light, right, to be able to counteract on this one. So that's this light over there. And you have the practical light that gives an ambience light overall. And on my side, I have added a few colored lights with LEDs to put a little bit of an ambience. You don't even need to go that far, right? Just one key light is amazing. And if you can have a practical light plus an edge light, that's amazing. Of course, the more you go, the better. Here we can see Chris Williamson in his setup, right? So it's a lot of work actually, but that's what a very good lighting looks like when you are face camera. And you don't need all your guests to have the perfect lighting neither, right? Just to be clear, if they do, it's amazing, but they don't need. And this is from the Spotify website directly, right? So we see that for the last 5 years, since 2020, even before Spotify was doing a Spotify Wrapped, Joe Rogan was the most listened to podcast. And he has stayed at the top of the Spotify charts for the last 5 years. Now, if you don't know that, Joe Rogan has signed a deal with Spotify in 2020, and one of the clause of the deals was that he would remove the podcast from Apple Podcasts. So this one has been lifted in 2024, February approximately, and already as soon as he got back on the platform, he got top 3 the very same year, with actually 2 months less than all the other podcasts, and he's competing literally with Crime Junkie and The Daily from The Times. So this is definitely a hell of a performance, and one might be rightfully asking, how did he do that? So let's have a look at how to rank in the chart. So first of all, there is very little transparency from the platforms on how to rank in the chart. Like Google, right, on how to rank in Google rankings. The platforms are staying a bit secretive because they don't want people to try and cheat the system and optimize just for the thing that will get podcasts at the top of the rankings. So obviously, we only have partial information here. Now, I'm going to give you exactly the information that Apple Podcasts has released, but also from our own experience making podcasts rank, what influences that dynamic. So first of all, you need to know that you need to choose a category, right? Business, entrepreneurship, comedy, news, whatever it is. And this will be the category that you will rank in. Now, of course, there is a global ranking as well with all the most listeners. This is what Joe is ranking in on Spotify in here. But you want a top ranking podcast in a specific category. So you need to choose the right one. It needs to be relevant, but there are also some categories that are easier to rank in than others. So here is the information we have from Apple Podcasts and our own experimentation. In order to have a top ranking podcast, you need to have a high number of downloads, a high number of followers / new followers, and a high completion rate, right? So this means people listening to the episode until the end. Ideally, within a short period of time, right? If you can have all this within 48 hours, this is huge and this is amazing. Now, a quick word about ratings, because you see that this is a stat that is not used in the rankings. So it is indeed not something that the platforms say is used to rank a podcast. Now, it is important for social proof, right? So when somebody goes on a podcast platform and finds out about your podcast, you want them to be able to see, oh, okay, this is a 4.9 rated show. There is 1,000 reviews. This is a show of quality that has been tested and proved by other people, I'm going to give it a go. Now, how do you do to actually get that? And here you can see my magnificent handwriting skills. So it all comes down to content, right? If you have great content, people will come back for more, people will recommend it, people will finish the episode, right? So content is key, hence it is one of the first things that we talked about in this video. Now, you need also a lot of people finding out about your show and playing it. So this all comes down to discoverability, marketing, and content. For the marketing part of things and discoverability, we're going to get back to this in a few minutes. And you need to keep people engaged throughout the episode. So this comes down to episode structure. So let's first tackle this, because this is a very interesting one, as Joe Rogan really doesn't follow best practice when it comes to episode structure, but he can because he has such a huge brand and such huge guests that make the machine work for him. So right now, what Joe Rogan has is an introduction music of like a few seconds, and then boom, we are back in the episode for 3 hours. Now, this is not what we typically recommend to have as a structure if you want to grow the podcast. And I'm going to show you exactly what you can do to strengthen the retention rate and the number of people listening to your episodes. Here is what we typically do when it comes to episode structure. So here again, you have some of my magnificent handwriting skills. And let's look at what an episode edited by GHG Marketing typically looks like. First of all, the first 5 to 10 seconds need to set and deliver on expectations set by the title, right? So when you start an episode, you need to be able to understand, okay, this is what this episode is about. This confirms the title, so this confirms the reason why I clicked on it, and this is what I should expect from the show. Ideally, you also want to have a bit of a teaser within the first minute of the episode to give you a reason to listen until the end, right? That's what you want to do. So the first 1 minute typically is made to make people want to stick till the end and listen to the whole thing. So what we typically do for this is we either extract snippets from the episode, we can sometimes do some trailers, right? If you don't want to go that far, you can start the episode with, in this episode, you'll discover. This is a formula that works very, very well. But for our clients and for our own podcast, we typically do snippets or even trailer. Then you can have an introduction, right? Narrated by the host with like, hey, this is the so-and-so podcast and this is what we talk about. My guest is so-and-so and we are breaking down everything. This is also where you want to have some call to actions, right? So you want to ask people to subscribe to the show if you want a top ranking podcast, to rate the podcast if you want to increase the number of reviews, or to share it with a friend if you want to try and get it to go viral. This is the type of call to actions that you can have. We recommend having only one specific call to action per episode, because if you give 3, 4, 5 actions to take for the listener, well, what will happen is that they won't take any. So you want to be very specific in the call to action. And this is typically where you're also going to have the sponsor reads, right? This is where if you have a sponsor podcast, you name the different sponsors. And then you have the episode, right? You can have some ads /sponsor /call to action breaks during the episode. So if your episode is not sponsored, this is where you can have a call to action to try and grow the podcast further. So at minute 30, for instance, saying something like, hey, if you're still listening to the episode, you're probably enjoying it or learning something from it. And it could help somebody else. So it would do me a huge favor if you could rate the podcast or share it with somebody you think will get insight from it. And with that, back to the show, right? A 10, 15-second call to action is more than enough, but will help you grow the podcast. And you can also have one later on. We like to have outros at the end of the episodes with, again, a call to action. Here, this is the best moment to ask for something, because people have listened till the end. They clearly got all the value from it. It's like, hey, if you're still here, it clearly means you got value from the episode, and it would mean the world to me if you share it with a friend. Something like this, or potential sponsors if you have, will be great at the end of an episode. This is how you can maximize for retention and maximize for people to take action whilst or after listening to you. Now, next we have marketing, right? So how do people find out about Joe's podcast? And here I really want to take the time to talk about the power of organic compounding growth, because this is really what happened for Joe Rogan's podcast. And we have plenty of things here. So let's start with the beginning. First of all, Joe had the opportunity to leverage an existing audience, right? So back to Steve Jobs' sentence, which is you can only connect the dots afterwards. Well, Joe was not a podcaster right from the get-go, right? He was a stand-up comedian. He was a UFC commentator. He was the host of Fear Factor. He was very active on forums like mixedmartialarts.com, which is still a pretty big forum right now. And he's built a following through his comedy specials as well. So Joe Rogan definitely had an audience before that he could funnel towards the podcast. So back to the point of like, that's not something that everybody can do, right? If you're starting from scratch, you don't have an existing audience that you can leverage, but that's also something that you can bear in mind in like, you're going to start building an audience with the podcast and you're going to be also able to leverage it further in the future if you start another activity. So it's never too late to start building an audience. Now, what Joe also has done is that he used YouTube as a growth engine. What do I mean by that? So he started the podcast as a live streamed show on Ustream in 2009, already with video. And the very early episodes were uploaded to YouTube, also with the YouTube channel GRE, so the Joe Rogan Experience clips, that became a major growth driver. Like he was posting clips there. It wasn't even the time of short form content yet, so it was like 5, 6, sometimes 10 minutes clip where he would just put a specific sequence of his podcast, and that would get dozens, if not hundreds, if not millions of views that people would find out about and then be redirected towards the podcast. Then there is, of course, the guest selection and cross promotion, right? Joe definitely has guests on the show that have huge following. So we can think of Elon Musk, right, with his appearance in 2018 when they started smoking, you know what. Jordan Peterson, also with a big following. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Mark Zuckerberg, more recently Donald Trump, and so on and so forth. So those guests, of course, come on the show to benefit from Joe's audience, but they also have their own audience that they bring on when people want to listen to them on a long format. Because again, that's a format that not everybody can do. That's definitely not something you can find in the mainstream media. So when somebody that you follow is going on Joe Rogan's podcast, you want to listen to that specific episode, even if you're not a follower of the Joe Rogan's Experience. Next thing is community engagement and authenticity. So Joe Rogan was really committed to interact with his audience, right? So he had tons of interaction on Reddit, specifically the Joe Rogan subreddit, right? But also on Twitter, which is now X. He also, as a lever of growth, used a bit of controversy and media attention. This is not something that he did on purpose, in my opinion, but that definitely benefited him in the long run, but maybe not in the short run. So he had some controversial episodes, right, which often attracted massive attention, like discussions around psychedelics or interviews with divisive figures, or even the interview with Elon Musk and what they did during the show. So, because it was literally an event that was covered virtually by every major outlet. And then another thing that's made a lot of noise and attracted lots of audience is the Spotify deal, right? So the exclusive licensing deal with Spotify in 2020 was widely reported, and that has put even more of a spotlight on Joe's podcast, which was a bit the idea for Spotify as well. So at first, the Wall Street Journal and others estimated the initial deal value at about $100 million, but the latest report suggested that it might be closer to $200 million actually. But whatever the amount, we all understood that this was a big deal, and if they were doing this, it probably meant that Joe Rogan's podcast was worthwhile listening to. And this is what happened. This attracted an additional audience. Again, what can we learn from this marketing strategy of Joe Rogan, which was partially deliberate and partially just, whatever is happening? So the first thing I want to mention here is podcast is a long-term game, right? Audiences compound, especially if you attract the right guest and if you wait a sufficient amount of time. I have not noted it here, but again, Joe started his podcast 16 years ago. I'm recording this video in 2025 and he launched in 2009. So obviously he had the time to accumulate a whole bunch of people listening to him, appreciating his content, coming back for more, and so on and so forth. So audience compound, as we have seen with the different endeavors that Joe had before. Also, clips on social media work if done well, because I've seen so many podcasters, using, for instance, an AI generating short form content platform where you just upload a long form video and it spits out 30 short form clips, which is good, right? You gain a lot of time, but those clips very hardly and rarely get any views. Is because you need to do this right. So here is the recipe that we use to make sure that short form content goes well when it comes from podcast content. The first thing that you need to look into is you need to select the right content. Like, there is no way around it. If you do not have good content in the first place, let alone use and select the right one for short form platforms, you won't get any views. So ideally what you want to select is controversial, a bit punchy, or high value add content. You need to put the right hook at the beginning, right? The first 3 seconds are critical when it comes to short form content. You need a good level of editing, right? The first thing is you want a fast-paced short form video, right? This is what people want to find on those platforms. And you also want to have some good visual and audio editing to retain attention. So the way we typically do it is for each and every episode for a weekly show, we will extract 3 snippets of less than 60 seconds following this exact SOP, and we post it on the 6 main social media platforms, right? So LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter/X, YouTube for YouTube Shorts, and TikTok. This allows us to produce 18 pieces of social media content for each and every episode that we release. That's adding up to dozens of thousands of views each and every month for any podcast in any field, really. And then the next point is the guests. At the end of the day, if you manage to get big time guests on your podcast that have a high level of influence, a big audience, and that they spend a great time on your podcast, they will talk about the episode. They will share it with their audience. And this is what you want to aim for. So back to the content, right? Great guests won't come if there is not a great reason for them to come. And having amazing content on your podcast is a very good reason, because then they can associate their image with that, which is what's happening for the Joe Rogan's Experience podcast. You also want to engage with your community, right? Even outside of the podcast. So this shows how much effort it can actually take to grow a podcast if you are doing it alone, right? So engaging with your community on forums, on people talking about your show or talking about the topics that you talk about your show can be very, very fruitful if you do it right on communities like Reddit and other forums dedicated to your specific niche. Now, the only thing I would like to mention around Joe's podcast is controversy, right? You need to treat controversy a bit carefully, especially if you have a business behind it, right? So for Joe, he is unapologetically himself on the podcast, even if that's attracting controversy and sometimes a bit the fire of the crowd, but he's fine with it, right? If you have a podcast, especially a podcast that is backed by a business, by your business, if you're a coach, consultant, B2B, SaaS, whatever it is, you might want to treat controversy a bit carefully. So this is not necessarily the lever that I would recommend using to grow your podcast, but if you like high level of risks, then definitely go for it. Now, there is something that Joe Rogan doesn't do, but that I would like to talk about. It is websites and email lists when it comes to podcasts. So Joe has a website, but it's clearly not part of his marketing nor growth strategy. Now, if you do have a website, right, where the podcast is hosted, or on the company's website, if you have a business behind it, you can have a dedicated podcast section. Why do I think this is important? So, first of all, if you're a business, and even if you're not, a website is probably the most important place on the internet for people to find out about you, right? Because this is where people can find out more about you, consume more of your content, engage with you, build trust with you. It's a platform that you own, right? We must not forget that your podcast on Spotify is somehow owned by Spotify. Same for Apple Podcasts, same for YouTube, same for any platform that doesn't belong to you, right? At the end of the day, they have terms and conditions. Of course, what they want is to attract as many people as possible on their platform and to keep them there. So if you help them do this with great content, then they will very likely keep your podcast and try to help you. But who knows? Anything can change, right? And they dictate their own rules. So for instance, if you're not in line with YouTube's policy, especially on controversy and certain topics, well, you might get your video/podcast demonetized at best and banned and taken off the platform at worst. So that's what the benefit of a website is. And again, if you have a company behind it, then definitely you want people to go on your website. And if you have the proper systems in place, you can also generate leads from that and generate sales. But I'm going to get back to this a little bit later on. So if you have a dedicated podcast section on your website, here is what you can do. You can have each episode having their own page, right? With YouTube player and Spotify player embedded, so people can watch and or listen to your podcast on your website. And it still counts as a view/downloads for those platforms. And what you want to have also, if it's relevant for your topic and your podcast, is an SEO optimized written article. Because if you do this, then you can also tap into the reading audience, right? And that's particularly relevant if you have an educational podcast or something that talks about news and trends, because there is for sure a reading audience for that, and you can tap into it just by leveraging your audio content. And last but certainly not least, this will also help you get your website to rank higher in long-tail Google keywords. So in a nutshell, in Google, you will rank higher, meaning more people will find out about your stuff and more people will engage with you. That's for the website. When it comes to email list, we are huge believers in email lists as well. whatever the objective of the podcast is, right? So if you start building an email list, and I'm going to explain you exactly how, if you start building an email list, you can update your email list about new episodes going live. So if you're doing things right, this is guaranteeing a minimum number of downloads for each and every episode that goes live. You can also nurture them about your services or offers that you might have from you or your partners. If you start dealing with sponsor and sponsorship deals, right? Sponsors love email lists, right? Because this is, if you have a good open rate, this is a guarantee to land into people's email box who are interested into your podcast. So if you do things right, this is also an audience that might be interested heavily into what a sponsor has to sell. So email lists are just gold, and you want to collect email addresses as soon as possible in the lifetime of your podcast. For this, you need a good lead magnet. So what we love to do is a free ebook related to the theme of the podcast. If you have a business, the lead magnet can be anything of high value that helps people solve the first problem that you help solving with your solutions. Like this, not only do you qualify those people when they download the ebook, right? Because who would download an ebook, for instance, on 3 ways to get rid of your back pain if they don't have a back pain? And if you're somebody helping with back pain, then you have a list of people who are interested into your stuff and who are willing to, take action to solve this problem. And then again, if not for the leads for your business, you can nurture them via email to update them about episode updates and so on. So here it's all about email marketing, having the right email sequence depending on how people behave and they react to your emails. You can put them into separate sequences, but that's getting a bit out of the premises of this video. But email lists, definitely recommend them for podcasters. All right, next, discoverability and consistency. So for Joe Rogan, he's the most known podcast in the space, so anybody consuming podcast might know about Joe, right? We still want to look into what he does when it comes to optimization of his discoverability and consistency. So how much does he get the audience used to get back to him and listen to new episodes? So starting with show title, right? So for Joe, it's pretty simple. It's called the Joe Rogan Experience. Not much more to say here, and I'm going to make a comment on each of the sections after having reviewed everything from Joe. When it comes to the show description, it's one sentence, the official podcast of comedian Joe Rogan. Here again, pretty succinct, but as said, most of the people know Joe Rogan. So if you're into podcast, you will know that you don't need much more in his case. For the categories, so what category did Joe choose to rank in, although he's ranking in the top podcast period? So for him, on Spotify at least, it is comedy, culture, and society, which is interesting. And I'm going to say a few more words about categories in a little while. For the episode titles, Joe goes for the episode number, right? And then the name of the guest. So here, I have a very specific opinion about this, but more about it in a couple of minutes. But that's what Joe does. And for the show notes, so here it's pretty succinct. And here you can see again my magnificent handwriting skills. A little bit about the guest, very succinct. The link towards the resource of the guest, which is interesting. Then the sponsors, right? The main sponsor of the episode, and some disclaimers around the ad choices. When it comes to consistencies, Joe releases an episode every day of the week, which is a pretty intense publishing schedule. But I'm going to get back to this in a few minutes. So that's the overview for Joe. Now, let's look at it a bit in details. So for the title, Joe Rogan has made the choice of calling his podcast the Joe Rogan Experience. So you need to know that a podcast title is the primary driver of discoverability, right? It is a little bit less required when you have a strong brand, obviously, like Joe, right? You have tons of big podcasters who bank more on the brand than on discoverability, because at this stage, this is not what's going to make the difference. But if you're starting, or if you have less than 1 million downloads a month, then you want to optimize your title. And I'm going to show you exactly how. So you need ideally the title to be keyword rich, based on research, right? So back to that point I was making earlier around making your research on your topic on Google Trends, Google Keyword Spanner, you need to look into what are the queries that people type on Google, because there is a very high likelihood that when they are searching for something on a podcast platform regarding this topic, they will do exactly the same. So you want to take inspiration from that to put the right keywords in your title. Also, title in the platforms isn't equal to the title on the artwork. What do I mean by this? I'm going to give you a tip on how to optimize for discoverability thanks to the title. But here, I'm really talking about the title, the way it's named on the platform, not on the podcast artwork, which at the end of the day is going to be the thing the most seen by people, but they're going to find you thanks to the title in the platforms. What do I mean by that? Let's take the example of my podcast. So my podcast is called Podcast Gurus. But the full title of my podcast on podcast platforms is Podcast Gurus, interviews on podcasting, podcast growth, podcast marketing, content strategy, and SEO. Like this, I know that anybody typing interviews on podcasting in Spotify or Apple Podcasts has a high likelihood of finding my podcast, because the chances of anybody looking for podcast content on podcast platforms typing podcast growth or podcast marketing or interviews on podcasting is much higher than somebody point blank typing podcast gurus. The other thing that you need to remember is that Spotify and Apple Podcasts are initially music apps, right? So the way you would look for music back in the days was you would type the exact name of your favorite artist or song, and that would give you an exact match. And if you type it right, the platform will serve it to you. Now, for podcasts, obviously, if you're looking for a topic more than a specific podcaster or podcast name, the podcast platforms still have a bit of a hard time figuring out what to serve you. So you need to help them as much as possible by optimizing your discoverability and SEO. And this is what properly titling your podcast does. Now, let's look at the show description. So for Joe Rogan, again, it's very succinct, and I do not recommend that if you don't have a huge brand and less than 1 million downloads a month, which I'm sure concerns most of you watching this video, except if you're watching right now, Joe, peace, man. So the show description is the secondary driver of discoverability, right? So it's the most important except for the show title. So it still needs to be taken care of. And it also will give a clear explanation of what the show is about for anybody reading the show description. So you do not want to miss that one. First of all, it needs to be short and concise. That's super, super important. You don't want to have a novel in your show description like many people do. It needs to contain keywords relevant to your industry. Here again, you want to put as many keywords as possible in there. For those knowing about SEO, this is what keyword stuffing is about, right? The podcast platforms are still 20 years late compared to Google when it comes to SEO. So you want to have as many keywords as possible inserted in the show description. And if you have a business, you can also put a call to action in there, or that can be the one for the email list. Once more, let's look at what we do at GHA Marketing. So our description is the weekly interview show where business and marketing leaders come to talk about the best practices in podcasting. You can listen to all our episodes and read our articles on ghapodcast.com, and topics for the show include B2B marketing, B2B podcasting, podcast, B2B lead generation, lead gen, backlink generation, SEO optimizations. So here again, we put in as many keywords as possible as to what we want to target. Next on, categories. So when it comes to categories, it helps discoverability and will be the criteria of what category you rank in. So here again, if your objective is to have a top ranking podcast, which can be very helpful to invite big time guests, right? Because if you say, hey, I have this podcast, can you come on the show? Versus, hey, I have a top 5 podcast in the marketing category. Do you want to come on the show? The effect is not the same. So if you want to try and rank in the charts, you need to select the right one, the one that is relevant for your podcast, but you can also navigate a bit the categories based on the fact that it's easier to rank for certain more than others. For instance, marketing is much harder to rank than management, but if you reach out to somebody saying that you have a top podcast in management whilst also talking about marketing, that might be all right. So it needs to be relevant, but you can make that arbitrage based on what you want to aim for with the podcast. So here again, for Podcast Gurus, what we chose was marketing, obviously, which is very hard to rank for, but we also chose the how-to, because we are literally talking about how to podcast. Now, next on, episode titles. So here, Joe does something that is very specific that I've seen a lot of podcasters do, which I definitely do not recommend. He just puts the name of the guest. So Joe can do that. The reason Joe can do that is because he has such big guests that if you're even remotely close to the industry of the guest, you will know who the person is. And when it's an Elon Musk, when it's a Donald Trump, when it's a Mark Zuckerberg, everybody knows that person. So it is very powerful to just put the name full stop. Now, this is not what I would recommend you do, and here is why. The episode title will basically be a decision driver of whether people are going to listen or not, right? 90% of people, so everybody except your hardcore fans, which are not that many, right? You might have some, which is amazing, but most people will make a decision on whether to listen or not based on the title, right? Does the episode talks about what I want to listen about? So you need to, with the title, hook attention, and trigger curiosity, and even better, trigger emotions. That's how you get people to click, right? So you need to make people want to listen, and you need to deliver on the title, right? I'm not just talking about being clickbaity here, back to the part of like doing the right content, releasing the right content, putting the right snippet at the beginning, right? And crafting a title around this. Because if you name your title 3 ways to become a billionaire in a week, well, not only is it not very credible, but also if people click on play and then you start talking about dogs, well, you're not delivering on that promise and people will bounce right away, which is not good for retention rate, which is not good for rankings. So you want to be a bit clickbaity, but you want to deliver on that clickbait as soon as possible in the episode. That's super, super important. But if you do so, then people get the satisfaction of like getting what they came for. And if you hook their attention properly, then you can keep them for the whole episode. When it comes to the name of the guest, so I definitely recommend having the name of the guest in the title at the beginning if it's a renowned guest that you know your audience will recognize, right? Because that's super strong social proof and that's good association. And at the end, if the guest is not really known, you still want to put it in the title because that shows that it is an interview-based podcast. And if your guest becomes renowned in the future, well, one of the first interviews was with you, so you want to have it recorded in the title for discoverability. And again, if you do SEO properly, especially on your website, this is again a driver for audience if that shall happen. So you want to have the name of the guest, beginning or the end, depending on the fame of the guest. The podcast title also needs to be keyword rich, right? You want to highlight clearly what's in the episode, again, for discoverability, and it can contain the episode number for proof. Like if you have, like Joe Rogan, 2,000 episodes, it's good to put the episode number because that shows like, hey, there are 2,000 where that comes from. But it's not mandatory. Again, let's look at what we do at GHA Marketing. So one of my recent episodes is called 24 Brutally Honest Truth About Podcasting Special Episode. So here again, I'm hooking the attention of the potential listener, right? By saying, hey, here is a list of 24 truth about podcasts that are brutally honest. When I interviewed Devon Tilley, I named the episode How to Build a 300 episode podcast that revolutionizes construction. Like here, anybody in the construction industry would be like, interesting, I might want to look into this. And any podcaster who is interested into understanding how to really keep on going with a podcast and have the consistency of releasing 300 episodes will want to listen to it. Another episode with Jack Sweeney, who has the podcast CFO Thought Leader, huge podcast in the finance space. I named the podcast This One Strategy, emphasizing on the one, is changing the future of podcasting. And here again, in this episode, I'm delivering on this promise. I'm literally talking about 24 brutally honest truth. We are literally talking with Devon on how to, keep on going for 300 episodes and how to revolutionize the construction industry thanks to a podcast. He's literally talking to government representative about law around construction thanks to his podcast, and that has a huge impact. And same for Jack, who has huge guests on the show, Only CFOs. Then let's look at the show notes, so the episode description. So here again, Joe has a very specific way of doing it, which I do not specifically recommend, but for him it works because he has just such a big podcast. So when it comes to show notes, the show notes are here to fill two functions, right? The first one is discoverability, right? It's the third way of getting your podcast discovered, but it also allows people to find out more if they're interested after they've listened to the episode. So how to make sure that you cover for both those functions? Well, first of all, discoverability, right? You want to have a keyword-rich show notes. So that means literally explaining what you talk about in the episode, and we're going to see an exact structure in the coming seconds. You also want to highlight what's in the episode, right? So a bullet point list, ideally with timestamps. Timestamps are not always mandatory, but it's nice to have them. You want to highlight who the guest is, right? And depending on your podcast, you also want to highlight who the host is. The reason I'm saying this is, yes, it's your podcast, right? People come for you. Well, maybe not. If you're doing your job right of growing the podcast, right? That means that at every episode, you have people listening to you for the first time, which is a good thing, right? But what if they don't know you? What if they don't know why they should listen to you? Having a quick bio of yourself, the host, in the show notes helps solve that. So people can immediately understand why you're legit to talk about what you're talking about and to create a relationship with you from the get-go. So that's why it's important to have that in your show notes. Then, how to allow people to find out more if interested. The worst thing you can do, right, is to have an engaged listener who loved your content, who loved your guest, or even better, who loved you, but who cannot follow up afterwards. You want to avoid that at all costs. The way you can do this is to have links in the show notes towards different resources. So I recommend as the very first thing to have a call to action towards your lead magnet if you're capturing email addresses, right? That's just gold. And that will allow people to consume more content from you, but also to give you their email address, so to give you a way to contact them, which is very, very valuable. You can also have link towards your website, towards your sponsors, if you have some, towards your social media. And you also want to have link towards the resources, right? So the guest resources and also any resource mentioned in the episode. So let's look at the show notes of a recent episode from Podcast Gurus, right? So as said, the first thing is, hey, look into the 3 ways to generate leads with your podcast ebook for free here on our website. And here I put the link to the website. I want to drive as many people as possible towards our website. Then welcome to Podcast Gurus, a quick description of the guest, right? Expect to learn, so the bullet point list about what's in the episode, much more, and then links, right? Again, I want to make it easy for people to connect with the guest and with me if they want. And last but certainly not least, for this section, consistency. So here we can see that Joe releases an episode every single day for 3 hours long episodes. So this is definitely not the easiest to do and implement. And if you have a business, you probably have something better to do of your time. And if you have a full-time job, you also cannot afford to spend that much time. But I still want to take the opportunity of this to talk about consistency. So obviously, when it comes to growing and compounding a podcast, publishing as many episodes as possible is the best thing you can do, as long as you don't compromise publication consistency for content. Content needs to be great, and then if you can publish as much content as possible, that is great, then this is gold. So what is our take when it comes to consistency? Obviously, the more episodes, the merrier. That's for sure. Now, the thing that you want to do with consistency is you want to make sure that people know when to expect a new episode. That's the base. And you want to have a short enough period of time between 2 episodes to get that compounding effect of podcast. So ideally, you want to publish every time the same day of the week and the same time of the day, right? You want to have that predictable pattern. You need to think, oh, but it's Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. This is my Podcast Guru's time. This is literally what you want to have. 1 episode per week is good. 2 episodes per week is great. The minimum we recommend if you want to grow a podcast, right? And if you do not have a huge brand behind it, is at least 1 episode every other week. This is what you need to create momentum. But again, we hardly work with any podcaster that does less than 1 episode per week, because if you start today in 2025, there are so many podcasts who are consistent with podcast episode schedule and release. You can hardly get something that grows fast with less than 1 episode per week. And last but certainly not least, monetization. So this is not a topic that helped Joe go from 0 to 190 million downloads per month, but this is definitely something that helped him make it sustainable, right? If you make money thanks to your podcast, you can do this full time, you can hire more skilled people, you can invest more in your gear, and so on and so forth. So I still wanted to talk about monetization. Now, obviously, over the last few years, Joe has just been a partner of Spotify, providing him with a very juicy deal and contract. But so, in 2020, there was this big deal that was first estimated at $100 million, seems that it's more like $200 million. And very recently, in 2024, a new contract has been put in place, which is worth as much as $250 million over a multi-year term. We don't have the details, but that's what people estimate. And here again, we can see that Joe has some ads. So is it money directly for him, or is it just Spotify pocketing all the money because they just provide Joe with that much of a multi-million-dollar deal? This is something that we don't really know, but we know that the way the podcast is monetized, whether the money goes for Joe or for Spotify, is through ads and sponsors. So what does that mean exactly? Well, you have 4 ways to monetize a podcast. So the first way to monetize is ads, right? So what is an ad exactly? So this is typically something that will be a 30 to 60 seconds read ad, either by the host or by somebody from the company advertising. And this will basically promote a generally mass market product, something like insurance or dog food or like chocolate, whatever it is. This typically pays podcasters between $10 and $20 CPM. CPM is cost per mille. Mille is the French for thousands, which means for every 1,000 downloads that you're putting the ads in front of, you can expect to get paid between $10 and $25, and this is before the platform's cut. So in the case of Joe Rogan, here again, that might be a bit particular because Spotify might be taking everything home, or they just take a percentage of it. But whatever it is, if you're starting this, if a common podcaster is starting ads, you can expect 10 to 25 CPM before the platform's cut. Now, the advantage of ads is that it's very easy to set up, right? You basically say, okay, I want a pre-roll, a mid-roll, and a post-roll ad on all of my episodes, and I know that I'm going to get paid that much for every impression that it gets, right? So pretty easy to set up. A lot of podcast hosting platforms propose it and come up with deal as long as your podcast fits certain criteria, such as episode length, minimum audience, and not controversial topics, of course. The thing is, this is very interesting for big audience podcasts, right? If you have a mass audience podcast, it's very, very good because if you have millions and millions of downloads each and every month, like Joe does, this can be very, very profitable. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because if you have a narrow niche audience, well, first of all, you won't make a lot of money, but there is a reason for that, right? Advertisers are not fools, right? They want to make money through ads. So the way they can do this is they know for every 1,000 people that they reach, they will make a certain volume in sales, right? And as long as the margin made by the sales pays off the advertisement budget, then this is a win-win relationship, except if it's for branding, but we are talking about something else. The whole point here is if you aim for a mass market product, you need to reach as many people as possible because there is a very low percentage of people that will purchase when they listen to the ads. So that's why you need a big audience for that. If you have a very narrow and niche audience, not only the advertiser will not make a lot of money, but you won't neither. So that's why I recommend this only if you have a very big audience, at least of a few 100,000 downloads per month. Now, when it comes to the second model, subscription, right? So here we are talking about having a Patreon or a Buy Me a Coffee or a Buzzsprout subscription model, right? Here you can expect between $5, $10, and sometimes $50 per month per subscriber. Now, the thing here is that it requires a bit of an additional setup, right? But it's easy to set up those platforms. You can call to action on your podcast to subscribe to the Patreon, right? It is very good for community creation because then you can interact with your patrons or the people buying you coffees. The thing is, this is usually a model that comes with high churn, right? Somebody will join the Patreon, but they will very early unsubscribe. The thing is, it requires additional work, right? If you want to incentivize people to pay you money to join the Patreon, you need to release something very specific and valuable on the Patreon, right? So that's be an additional podcast episode or some one-on-ones with you, or if you have a business behind it, some coaching session, whatever it is. This is the constraint of subscription. I like this model because this allows you, if you have a very loyal audience, to give them something to access you. This is typically the Twitch subscribers model, right? They give you money every month and they can get additional perks. So this can be very good to create a bond with your community and actually have this interaction, but it's much more work than just maintaining the podcast. So to be taken with a pinch of salt. Next one is sponsorship. So this is where things become interesting for podcasters, especially if you have a more niche/narrow audience. What do I mean by that? So here you can find any sponsor, right? What I mean by sponsor is this is not something that a platform brings you, but more a brand that you are going to find on your own or that reaches out to you individually to be like, hey, we would like to sponsor the podcast. That's what I mean with sponsorship. Now, here again, if you have a general podcast, say an entertainment podcast, right? And you don't really have a niche audience, for instance, you're not talking about, I don't know, people aged more than 60 years old playing peekaboo in South Africa only in winter. That is a very niche audience, and therefore any person targeting this specific audience might be interested into sponsoring your show. But if you have a general podcast, sponsors will propose you CPMs relatively close to what advertisers would propose on podcast hosting platforms. So this is where having a niche audience becomes very interesting because we are negotiating sponsorship deals for our clients. So we know exactly how far this can go. And we've negotiated deals from $300 to $500 CPM, meaning for every 1,000 downloads that the advertisers get in front of, they are paying the podcaster somewhere between $300 and $500. That means $0.50 for every download. And this is where it becomes very interesting because even if you have just a 20,000 downloads per month podcast, you can make $10,000 a month per sponsor. So this is where things can become very interesting. And we have some very, very niche podcasts, which I won't name, that negotiate up to $3,000 CPM, meaning for every download that the advertiser, that the sponsor gets in front of, they pay the podcaster $3. Now, this can happen when the sponsor has very, very high ticket offers, right? And one conversion can make a tremendous return on investment, which can happen if you have a very, very niche podcast with a high purchasing power audience. Now, here, obviously, there are some drawbacks, right? It is a bit harder to set up. First, in most of the cases, sponsors won't reach out to you. You need to reach out to them, right? So I have a whole video on my YouTube channel on how to do that. I'll put the link in the description. But it can be much more profitable for smaller audience. You, of course, again, need to negotiate yourself with the sponsors, right? So this is where it's good to be accompanied, or at least to get a bit of information and education before moving forward with this model. But that can be very, very profitable. And the last way to monetize your podcast is a bit something special, which is not for all podcasters, because the first three are possible for any podcast. The last one is if you have a business behind it, right? So if you have your own offer. Now, if you think about it, you will only find sponsors and advertisers if it makes sense for those sponsor and those brands to advertise on your podcast. And by if it makes sense, I mean if they will make a return on investment, so that's part of their communication budget and their margin, right? But what happens if you have your own offer and your own distribution channel? And all of a sudden you can keep all that margin and just drive traffic towards your offer. Therefore, the CPM can be unlimited, really. Like if you have a $50,000 offer and you have an audience of 10,000 people and every month just 1% of those convert, so 10 people, well, you can make a lot of money. So obviously I'm taking a bit the extreme in terms of examples, but we have podcasts that make multiple dozens of thousands of dollars each and every month using this method. And actually one of our podcasts made just over 1 month, so the podcast Corporate Treasury 101 made just over 1 month $22,495 in sales, just because we have this very specific offer that we provide together with a partner and that we sell to our audience, which is providing a high amount of value, and that is very relevant for our audience. Now, here again, the other perk is that it keeps the highest level of trust, right? If it's your own offer and it's your own audience, you're not selling somebody else's product, right? So whilst you're not in charge of delivery with sponsors, here you are. So you need to deliver properly, but that also means that you can keep and hold the trust of your audience. And of course, the only drawback is that it requires an offer on your own and a funnel to get these people from passive listeners to buyers, right? Which is something that is completely different and that I will not talk about in this video. And that is pretty much it, ladies and gentlemen. We've been through quite a lot in this video. So hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it insightful. If that's the case, once more, don't hesitate to leave in the comments whatever you found the most useful in this video. If it was useful and you're still here, please give me a thumb up and a comment and potentially a subscribe to the channel. That will mean the world to me. And if you would like to get an analysis of your own podcast, well, then hit me up on LinkedIn. Just tell me that you've watched this video, that you'd like an analysis for your podcast, or that you'd like an analysis on how a podcast could benefit your business. Send this to me on LinkedIn and we will get going with crafting your very own personalized analysis. Cheers.